So we now have a wonderful opportunity for you people here today who've taken time out of your schedule to invest in being here to engage more directly now with our fantastic speakers in our panel discussion. So I know many of you will have all sorts of thoughts running through your mind after hearing our speakers talk to you today. But before I give you a chance to raise your hand and ask your question, I've got a couple of things that I would love to put to the panel, things that I'm particularly interested in. And the first one of these is, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, Tim referred to it and I did as well in my introduction, that I know some organisations are moving now in their recruitment process to remove names on CVs when they're doing the shortlisting process. And I'm particularly interested in the panel's thoughts on this.
Well, it's a good idea. If the evidence is telling us that bias exists and it can play out through names on CVs, then let's try an alternative way of doing it. Let's de-identify CVs and see what happens. The Victorian government is currently trialling such a thing. There's a partnership of 20-odd organisations, including the private and public sectors, that are doing this, and it will be very interesting to see the results of their trial. This has also been trialled overseas, in Europe, and even in the UK. So we are by no means doing anything radical in de-identifying CVs here. Bear in mind, though, that this only really works at a certain level with organisations or industry. Obviously, it's not going to work very well with leadership positions, given that you'll be able to know exactly who people are when you're talking about senior positions and applications, and de-identification isn't perhaps going to have any purchase there. But what it can do is it can ensure that you don't have an issue of bias playing out through recruitment and through the entry level of an organisation or industry.
Great, thank you, Tim. Other members on the panel, would you like to comment?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think anything that does support people being able to actually enter into the employment space on merit is a good idea. I mean, imagine putting out a resume where you put your age on the resume and you put your status, just gotten married, about to have a baby, hopefully soon. Would you please recruit me? I mean, anything that actually assists to de-identify if it's going to be a barrier, I think is a good thing. I do think that in certain areas like ours, for example, if we're trying to recruit someone, we can't afford to actually read the name first and say that that's going to be an issue. We've got to be looking at the skills and the experience of the individual, and I think the name is something we'd probably look at last, no matter what level of position that was. But I think if it's an issue, then yeah, anything that will assist with that.
I was just going to add, we've had many examples of our client base anglicising their names to get a foot in the door, and without fail, an interview appears once they do that process. We don't encourage it, but it does happen and it does make a difference.
Okay, great, thank you. So another question that I had, which is also along the lines of how we go about attracting and selecting people for our organisations, is we often hear organisations talk about cultural fit and choosing somebody in terms of whether they are a good cultural fit. And I'm interested in the panel's views on this in terms of encouraging diversity.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. I think having awareness, doing training in unconscious bias, having the policy targets and raising that awareness in the first instance is really important to understand where a bias might come from, say, in the recruitment process. Recruiting for cultural fit, if you have values that are about people and the humanness of people and the acceptance of people, I think that's a good start to stop that sort of concept that people that fit mean they've got to fit in my own likeness. that sameness, and that is not a way to support success in an organisation. But I do think there's a lot of work that has to be done around the education and importance of diversity and how that contributes to an organisation's success, so that people are seeking diversity and seeking it willingly, because it's going to support the success of the organisation, is one way of ensuring that people aren't trying to recruit in their own likeness. And if they are, then you've recruited the right people in the first place that are all about diversity, and that's the likeness that they're trying to recruit for.
Thanks, Darlene. Nicole, I think people would be interested in your view on this, given the people that you're working with.
Yeah, I guess we don't have to work too hard in that space. I think our staff see firsthand the challenges of promoting their client base to employers and trying to get them a job. So they firsthand see that struggle, that issue. So we haven't had to work too hard to get a very diverse workforce. So people are naturally attracted to that industry. It's a helping industry. People see they can add value to that. So we just get applicants in that space and we recruit them. Over time, they become the recruiters in your business as well, and it just happens.
And Nicole, what about your role in terms of influencing your clients and I guess what they're looking for?
Yeah, so as I said, our staff as role models are really important, especially for our younger job seekers. If they can see a similar face, a similar background, a similar language group when they walk through the door, there's a level of comfort there, particularly for our humanitarian entrants who usually come to us with lots of issues and lots of trauma and all sorts of things, some really horrific backgrounds. That really, really does make a huge difference in terms of inspiring those people to not give up and keep going and to win a job.
Thanks, Nicole. Tim, would you like to comment on this one as well?
Yeah, just to add to what Darlene was saying, you shouldn't use cultural fit as a way of disguising biases in your organisation or just reproducing the status quo. If you have transparency about your values are and about the kind of culture you want in your organisation, then obviously, yes, there can be a meaningful way to talk about someone having cultural fit or not in your organisation. But if you're using it as a code to communicate that someone isn't like us, or they don't look the right way, or they don't dress the right way, then it can get in the way of getting more diversity in the door. There was a study that was recently done in the UK around social mobility, and one of the findings of this study involved how cultural fit played out in investment banks in London. And investment banking in London is heavily dominated by graduates of Oxbridge. And the way that cultural fit was spoken about within investment banks came down to things like the shoes that people wore, how people tied their ties, whether they got their shirt and tie combination right. Now, that's not the kind of cultural fit that would be meaningful in any way to an organisation interested in integrity. Cultural fit is just another way of saying class.
Yeah.
And class can be something that can have connotations for race, connotations for gender, connotations for other elements of diversity too. So if we're going to deal with cultural fit, part of the challenge must be to ensure that everyone in our society or organisation has a fair shot at being let in and has access to the unwritten curriculum of power and leadership. Because quite often these are the rules that are passed on very quietly and insidiously, but if you can throw that into, expose that to sunlight and have more transparency about what cultural fit actually means, I suspect you'll be able to see organisational change.
Great, thank you. Okay, we've now got a chance to open up to you people in the audience for your questions. So can you please raise your hand with your question? And we have Jim over here with a microphone, so you can put your question to the panel. So don't be shy, thank you. We've got a question over here.
Hi, I just had a question for the panel. I work at Optus. I lead one of the legal divisions, and I just made a note. So we've got about 40 lawyers, 50% women, combination of gay, straight, single, family, and culturally we have Indians, Russians, Irish, Chinese, Malays, Greeks, Italians, English, Jewish, and Hungarian. Cover the board. But I have a question on the issue of cultural fit. So when I hire a lawyer into the team, you do take a risk that culturally this person may not fit within the team. And there is that 3-month probationary period, which I think is too short, to work out whether or not they are a good cultural fit. Do you think that there's enough done for employers if that person doesn't fit within the team, that it's easy for us to say, well, you weren't a fit? I think there's a lot of pressure to say, well, make it work, even though there is a genuine misfit.
Well, the key here, I would say, would be for articulating what the culture of the organisation is, what the expectations are, and having as much publicity and transparency around your decision-making as possible. So, as I said, of course, you want to have people enjoying cultural fit with your organisation. Let's just make sure that we're absolutely clear about what cultural fit means, rather than using it in a more ambiguous way to cloud or disguise what may be forms of invidious bias. That would be my view on it. But, there may well be people who simply don't work out. And in that case, it's fair to say that they didn't work out because of an issue with cultural fit. But if you're preemptively saying that someone should not be considered for the role or isn't quite right because, even though they're well qualified and even though their track record is great, there's just something about them that just makes me wonder if they've got the right fit. Now, that is the scenario that I think should send the alarm bells ringing. If someone's perfectly qualified, has a great track record, then they perhaps deserve the benefit of the doubt so that you can work out whether there is a genuine fit or not. So I don't know if that... Yeah, and... Sure. And that's why I think that's why I would say having a transparent set of criteria and being very open about it is the way to do it. If you don't talk about what your culture is like and what your expectations are, then you may well have situations where people can assume that it's because of this reason or that. But if you're absolutely clear about the criteria you use, and this goes back to what I was saying about merit, you define merit. You don't just say, oh, we make decisions here based on merit, but don't tell us what merit is. You actually have to explain what merit is about, what are the metrics you're using, what's your criteria, and I would say that would be my view on the best defence that employers would have in ensuring that you strike the right balance.
And I agree with it. Look, absolute clarity is so important, and so what we've done is to actually define what are the behaviours that we'd expect to see around our values, and then so what it looks like and what it doesn't look like, and they are very much about the way someone just basically is fulfilling their role, and they're really about people interacting with each other around respect and in no way could be attributed to to gender or different backgrounds or anything like that. So that's one aspect, but also the role itself, having absolute clarity around the expectations of the role and the way in which someone needs to actually fulfil the inherent requirements of the role, and then having really good practices in place around giving people feedback, especially in that probation period, is just so critical, so that they actually get an understanding of what the expectations are and what you want them to do to improve during that probation period. And I think that what that does is protects an organisation from someone saying, "Oh, you dismissed me because I was the wrong gender or anything else." So having clarity protects the organisation and actually having clarity protects and fosters support for the individual. And I always say in many situations, look, smother people with kindness and communication, and you won't get it wrong yourself, but you also won't get it wrong for the individual. You'll flesh out those that where they may have actually been recruited and they weren't right for the role. That will be fleshed out really, really quickly, and then it'll be based on the fact that they can't fulfil the inherent requirements of the role. So I think that clarity is just so important.
Thanks, Darlene. Nicole, I'm sure you must see this with the people that you work with, perhaps individuals that are placed, but for whatever reason it doesn't work out, maybe coming back to you and saying, hey, it was because of my race or my background.
Yep. So one, we have the issue as an employer in our own right in terms of we have a very diverse workforce. So just to touch on, it's probably you're talking about what are those desired behaviours and how you get those values across around how you want to operate, and it's really pushing that in induction, making sure you get that right in that first, I think it's 6 months with employees, but good mentoring from our end in terms of our client services. We often will have, it fell over, a placement fell over and you look back in it and it was for cultural reasons. A lot of the time it's just misunderstandings and lack of communication between the employer and the new employee. And countless examples. So having good mentoring and having the best strategy for us is having someone that job seeker can talk to and say, oh look, this is going on, and we can often advocate to the employer and broker that outcome.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nicole. What other questions do we have? Mike too? Just feel free to raise your hand during this question if you do have another question.
Hi, it's Lauren from SYC. My question's around, is diversity in the entry-level positions enough for eventually equity to be held at leadership, or is actually direct strategies required to get equity balance at a leadership level?
Tim, do you want to talk to this one first? Yep.
Yeah, well, many of us may assume that if you have the weight of numbers behind you and you let time take its course, then organically you will see change come through. I guess that's the kind of sausage stuffing view of how change can happen. I'm not sure that you can take that for granted, because we are seeing we are seeing in numerous sectors, and I'd identify perhaps a few, financial services, professional services and the legal profession across the country, where you would have no shortage of cultural diversity at the more junior levels of firms and organisations, but yet they're not coming through. So there's clearly a blockage here. So in theory, the weight of numbers should come through if you have a meritocracy, but that's not how it's playing out at the moment, because there are blockages. Now, where those blockages are will depend on the organisation and the industry. With some cases, the blockage may well happen very soon after graduates do their graduate rotation. There may well be a path dependence at play. The job you have 2 years after you enter as a graduate in an organisation may have an enormous bearing on whether you are going to be entering the leadership stream. In some other industries, that may not play out in the same way. So there's no one-size-fits-all answer to this. The pivotal element here is around what the evidence says and what the data says. If you have the data, you can probably work out very quickly where that blockage is occurring. But if you don't measure cultural diversity, if you don't monitor how you're faring, you may have no idea whatsoever about where those blockages are emerging. And I would say that's perhaps where we're at the moment. We don't have enough data on this to be able to make authoritative statements about where those blockages are emerging. My sense is it's emerging probably in mid-career and well before people get to senior management positions, and I'm talking here about CEO minus 3 or 4. If we were to replicate, for example, that exercise we did for the 3 or 4 rungs below CEO, I don't think the numbers would look much different.
Did anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I was
That one,
gonna
yeah.
say, I don't think it's going to naturally happen unless there is a lot of positive strategies put in place and it comes from the top. How many gender lunches, initiatives, things have many of us attended over many, many, many years, and there hasn't been a whole lot of movement in that space. So I don't believe it won't happen unless there's strong leadership on it from up the top, leadership programs and cherry picking staff who may not normally put their hand up for things, and that positive discrimination in that space. I think needs a lot of focus.
Darling, do you want to comment briefly on that one?
It starts in the boardroom. What conversations are being had there? What are the policies, targets, and measures? Is the awareness being raised? I mean, that's really where the conversations need to start in organisations. And I think that it's amazing how the leadership focus will change when the most senior area in the organisation is actually asking questions about it. And so that's really where, for a lot of organisations, that's where it really needs to start. And that's really where the gender issue has actually been picked up, where boards actually have those conversations and take that on. And I think it's the same with this. It is an important issue, and it does need to happen there.
Great, thank you. Now there was another question. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Pamela Lee. It follows on from an earlier question regarding what you put or what you include in your CV or resume. I was just interested in the panel's thoughts on, you mentioned, obviously we don't generally put age these days or date of birth, but what about actual history, career history? Because if you don't start to chop off a certain amount, then that gives away your age. But if you don't include a certain amount, that might look like you don't have the experience for the type of role that you're actually applying for. So I'm just interested in the panel's thoughts, and thank you very much. I've really enjoyed your comments this afternoon as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Pamela.
I can just comment on what we look at. Generally, I know that when we're going through and recruiting, we generally look at the most relevant 10 years rather than sort of trying to trawl too far back. If someone's actually putting in, 25 years and a lot of detail about different roles, beyond 10 years, you start to sort of question the relevance. So it sort of just depends on what the position is, what you're seeking. Is it about the depth of experience that you're looking for over a long period of time, or is it that you want the most relevant roles in the last 10 years? So I always encourage people when they ask me that question, if I'm mentoring someone and they're actually looking to develop their career and they're applying for roles, I always say to them, summarise the most relevant and make that, the 10 to 15 years. The rest, just do a summary about your previous experience, because you can talk about that in an interview. And the objective with a CV is to actually get the interview where you can then talk further. So I say to people, don't provide your life story. Make it as relevant as possible.
Great, thank you. Good words of advice, I think. Nicole, did you want to add anything? You'd be, as an organisation, providing advice, I imagine, all the time about applicants' CVs.
We see some good ones too.
Yeah.
I'd support everything that was just said. Keep it relevant to the role you're applying for. Most people just want to see those last 1 or 2, 3 jobs that you've had that are particularly relevant. If you've done something back when that is now relevant to that role, include it, or just do a summary at the end. Probably the other challenging areas for young people who have very little or no work history, and how they sell themselves. So you might all have children who, you're encouraging them to include things like their participation in sport and voluntary experience and like those types of things. But definitely tailor it, think what the employer's looking for, and keep it short, sharp and shiny.
Great.
Sorry, can I just add to the question? I think it is such a relevant point for people that actually still consider that they've got years to go in their career and they're still really vibrant and want to contribute and love what they do. The challenge of making sure that you're not going to be disadvantaged because you're older. We can't afford to be doing that because in many areas there is a skills shortage, and we need to value every area of skills. So I think it's really important that people are being conscious of those sorts of things when they're actually putting a CV forward.
Great. Thank you, panel. We've got another question over here. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name's Franco Perella. I'm from one of the universities here in South Australia. In fact, the best university here in South Australia. It's Uni SA, by the way. Look, I've got a very short statement and then a question to any of the panel members. So the short statement is basically, I'm just going to put to the panel that I think in Australia we've done pretty well on the message of discrimination is bad. I'm not sure we've done so well on what actually discrimination is. So that's the first statement. But the question I've got to any of the panel members is, when you're actually at the leadership table and you're actually trying to engage leaders to essentially walk through, and these are my words now, walk through this quagmire of priorities, these are my deliberate words here, race, age, disability, etc. What are you finding is the best way? Is it the data? Is it the examples? So I'm deliberately trying to prod you a bit here. What do you actually find really works at the leadership table? Thank you.
Great.
Do you want to?
I'm sure I'm happy to have a crack. There's a lot of truth to what you say about us understanding discrimination but not actually explaining what it practically involves. Quite often the biggest point of resistance that I come across with respect to race is the notion that racism is bound up in a belief in racial superiority, or is about very overt systemic forms of discrimination, for example, segregation or apartheid, and that anything short of that isn't really racist. My view is that discrimination is as much about the impact as it is about the intention. You can actively discriminate against someone without meaning to do so. You may have all the good intentions of the world, but belittle someone or rehearse stereotypes against them which have a harmful effect on their prospects. Those things still count as discrimination. So this is not the province of evil, malicious people who concoct of devious ways to actively discriminate and subjugate people who they believe are of an inferior race, first of all. With respect to your question about what works with leaders, personal experience or skin in the game I've found to be very powerful in this. And I'll give you the example from gender equality to illustrate. I mentioned Male Champions of Change earlier, a group of male CEOs and senior leaders who've advocated for gender equality. What struck me about that group is that so many of them speak about how having a daughter has transformed their understanding of gender equality. I've heard CEOs say it wasn't until they started thinking about their daughter's professional future that they really got what gender equality was about. In my own work, it's no accident that those who are most responsive to the issue of cultural diversity tend to be those who come from overseas themselves, have a spouse who comes from a different background, who've lived or worked in other countries, or who have adopted children from elsewhere because it's personal for them. And this is one area where it's really difficult for people in leadership positions to place a priority on something like cultural diversity. They may understand the analytical argument perfectly fine, but unless they have a passion for it, they may not be compelled to act on it. And that is the challenge that I come across all the time, trying to find ways to get personal with the issue and using that then in tandem with the analytical argument for why we should do diversity better. Quite often it's easier to get one but not the other. Getting both is your best prospect for success.
Great, thank you, Tim. Do other people want to comment on that one?
Yeah, I just think it's good management. So measure it. You know, do you know who you've got in your workforce right now? Do all the basics. Have good policies in this area. Shove it down your staff's throats around what is discrimination, what is bullying and harassment. Do training on it. Do cultural awareness training, whether it's on different cultures or Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander training. We do all that stuff very, very routinely, and it just shifts the culture, it shifts the recruitment practices. You know, put it in your ads that you're encouraging diversity when you're recruiting for people. I think if you just get those basics right, have good managers, it just works and it happens.
Thanks, Nicole. Darlene, would you like to have a say on that one as well?
The concept of, you know, that we haven't done well on discrimination, I think to a certain extent, it really starts sort of in schools and in homes, and the sort of, I think this desire for sameness and anything that's different. You can discriminate just because someone doesn't look the same, doesn't talk the same, because they're not tall enough, they're not slim enough, they're not something enough, or there's something too much. You know, they're all versions of judgment and discrimination, and I think that respecting other people is where it really starts and builds from there. I think in organisations, yes, having the targets, having the measures and having the conversations are all important, but at the end of the day, if someone in their mind is fearful and is inclined to be, to sort of place judgments and discriminate, then the peer pressure is really important. People being brave enough to speak up and then being supported to actually talk about the fact that something is not acceptable. But I think having it on the social agenda, it's amazing how in organisations where perhaps that discrimination is acceptable and recruiting in their own likeness, those organisations, if you read what the futurists are saying, those organisations will not survive into the future. But if they're there now and they'll survive long enough to perhaps be creating some damage and not supporting what's really going on out there in the social environment, having it on the social agenda, having it in the media, having it as something that is no longer acceptable in society. I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, you know, going out for a long lunch and not coming back to work was the acceptable way of doing things. Now, actually getting behind a community cause and taking your team out to support a community volunteering program, which is something that never would have been heard of in the 80s because everyone was out for the long lunch. This is all about what's on the social agenda. You know, what is acceptable in society now, and we have to make discrimination unacceptable in society. And we have to do that and educate in every area that we can, that it's not only unacceptable, that it is just stupid and dumb. It's not going to support businesses into the future. It is something that we should all find abhorrent and call it out when we see it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Darlene. And unfortunately, we don't have time for any further questions, but I think that was a good point to close on. I'm just going to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to join me in thanking our fantastic speakers and panellists today.